In the TV series Better Call Saul, Jimmy McGill is a fledgling lawyer desperate to make a name for himself. This leads him down a dark path. But, had he worked as a lawyer in the video game industry, maybe, just maybe, he makes a boatload of money, checks his worst impulses, and Saul Goodman never goes to prison. After all, there was plenty of money to be made. The courtroom has settled countless gaming industry disputes over the decades. Just recently, Microsoft acquired Activision in a $68.7 billion deal that triggered a litany of lawsuits. There was a shareholder fiduciary duty lawsuit, a lawsuit centered around workplace culture, as well as several different antitrust lawsuits. One of which was a class action suit brought forward by a group of gamers based out of California. The amazing thing about that one is that the gamers, while they technically didn't win, reached a settlement agreement and were paid an undisclosed amount of money. One of the most common lawsuits you'll see in the video game industry are patent infringement suits. Take Acceleration Bay, for example. Acceleration Bay is a company that does, well, I have no idea, honestly. Based on what I've read, they mostly just patent troll other companies, and they go after some pretty big fish. In just the last 10 years, they have sued Activision, EA, and Take-Two, who owns 2K and Rockstar, both of which were included in lawsuits. Acceleration Bay purchased a portfolio of patents from Boeing. These patents focused on technology for large-scale networks geared towards peer-to-peer distribution. They claim these companies used said technology to build their online multiplayer platforms. Their success rate is a mixed bag. Their most notable success was against Activision, where a federal jury ruled in favor of Acceleration Bay and ordered Activision to pay $23.4 million in damages. However, they would suffer losses against Take-Two and EA. A more notable and polarizing patent infringement lawsuit is Nintendo's suing of Pocket Pair due to gameplay mechanics used in their most recent title, Palworld. Pocket Pair generated almost $500 million in revenue in the first few months of the game's early access release, so at least they have money to spend in their fight. The early days of the video game industry were a bit like the Wild West. For every Thomas Goldsmith Jr. out there, filing patents for things they weren't even sure would see the light of day, there were several guys like William Higginbottom, A.S. Douglas, and Steve Russell. These inventors created things for PhDs, personal entertainment, and experimentation. Many early contributors to the industry rushed onto the scene without regard for patents. Ralph Baer, creator of the original Magnavox Odyssey, was regarded for his attention to detail and meticulous note-taking. Baer accrued over 150 patents in his career, and while it was technically his employer, Sanders Associates, that owned the key patents in the lawsuits to come, none of that happens without Baer. Those key patents would go on to shape the early days of the video game industry. In his book, Video Games in the Beginning, Baer writes that Magnavox, which was acquired by Philips in 1975, pulled in close to $100 million in licensing fees and lawsuit settlements. This is far more money than any of their consoles would go on to make, and it's not particularly close. Magnavox had everything they needed to dominate the industry. They could have been the first industry giant. But that's not exactly how things turned out. So, before we look into what enabled Magnavox, Philips, and Sanders Associates to profit so greatly off these patents, let's take a look at the empire that never was. Magnavox's strategy when it came to designing and marketing its consoles can best be described as confused and short-sighted. The original Magnavox Odyssey was released in September of 1972 and sold around 350,000 units over its lifespan, a number that Ralph Baer was disappointed in. Despite its pioneer status, the console is considered a commercial failure. It has long been said that consumers were confused by the marketing, as it led people to believe that the Odyssey only worked on Magnavox TVs. But I don't think the advertising is to blame. On a game show called What's My Line, product manager Bob Fritchie played the Odyssey, and when asked if it runs on any TV, he had this to say.
very detailed, and I think people will have a great deal of fun playing
Now,
that.
how can you use it? Can you use it on any television set at all?
Yes, Larry. It works on any TV, primarily 18 inches through 25 inches. That's by design of the overlays that we have for the product right now, but certainly it'll work on any TV.
The episode aired in October of 1972, just 1 month after release. Newspaper ads and TV commercials around the time of launch also very clearly state that the console hooked up to any 18 to 25-inch TV set. So where does the confusion come from? It probably had to do with the fact that Odyssey consoles were only available at Magnavox retailers until 1974. I don't know if this is consumer confusion or consumers being ignorant to the console's existence. If you hadn't seen an ad or been inside a Magnavox retailer, to you, the Odyssey was just an old book written by a Greek poet. Billboard magazine reports that Magnavox spent $9 million marketing its consoles in 1974. The Odyssey was featured as an accessory for their higher-end offerings. This $9 million marketing budget included a TV special featuring Frank Sinatra, who I hear wasn't cheap. Eventually, Magnavox would see an uptick in sales, and while the TV special might have helped bump the sales, we know of something that definitely contributed to the bump. Atari's arcade Pong had become a hit, but if you wanted to play Pong at home in 1974, the only real option was the Odyssey. Nope, not that one. Magnavox directly benefited from their rival's success. Despite the Odyssey's bump in sales, Magnavox's overall business was way down by the end of 1974. It was around this time that Magnavox decided it was in its best interest to begin filing patent infringement lawsuits against anyone and everyone they could find making arcade versions of Pong, but we'll circle back to those. It was also at this point that the Netherlands-based company Philips, through their North American branch, organized a contentious bid to purchase Magnavox. The deal was finalized in 1975. Not long after the release of the original Magnavox Odyssey, Ralph Baer lost a lot of input when it came to the development of future Magnavox consoles. Due to the underwhelming sales of the original and the widespread success of arcade Pong, Magnavox shifted its strategy and began producing dedicated home Pong consoles, and thus, the Odyssey 100 series was born. The first of which was, you guessed it, the Magnavox Odyssey 100. Released in late 1975, the console was priced at $99.95 at launch. The black and white console had only 2 games, tennis and hockey. Graphically, the 2 game modes looked nearly identical. There was a plastic slider on the console that allowed players to keep track of the score, and 2 knobs that adjusted the center line and ball speed. The 100 wasn't alone. Magnavox released the Odyssey 200 for $129.95 alongside it as a deluxe option. You might be asking yourself, what was so deluxe about this 200 model? The 200 was also a black and white console, but it added 2 game modes in Smash and Doubles. Smash was a digital version of Squash. Doubles mode featured 2 paddles on either side of the screen, but was still only a 2-player mode. It also featured adjustable ball speeds. Well, now you might be asking, where on earth does Magnavox get off selling the 100 for the same price as the original Odyssey and the 200 at a $30 price hike? Both models played far fewer games, and it's easy to see how the consumer might see them as technically inferior to the original. And in some ways, they were. Most notably in the lack of game modes and lack of wired controllers, leaving players huddled over the console to control the paddle. In the 1970s, the US economy was volatile. The average cost of living was steadily rising. Magnavox felt it too, with the price of the parts required to build the device going up as well. This is what led to the unwelcoming launch price of their deluxe model. Across the pond, the 200 model would be the first console Philips released under its own brand name following the acquisition of Magnavox in 1975. They called it the Philips Odyssey 200. It was functionally the same as its North American counterpart, with slight cosmetic differences. The console was released throughout Europe starting in 1976. Elsewhere around the world, Magnavox issued licenses to companies like Epoch. The Japanese company released the Epoch Electro Tennis in 1975. Back in the United States, following the passing of the Consumer Goods Pricing Act, which allowed for retailers to sell products for lower than the manufacturer's suggested retail price, Retailers dropped the price of both the Odyssey 100 and 200, a trend that would continue with all subsequent Odyssey consoles. Now, by the end of 1975, Magnavox was no longer alone in the home console sector. Atari released its first home console version of Pong through a partnership with Sears Roebuck in late 1975, just in time for the holiday season. It bore the Telegames brand and was a massively successful partnership. Atari would eventually release home console Pong under the Atari brand in 1976, and it would help stabilize their company. Both Atari and Magnavox would find their console prices being undercut by a company called Coleco in mid-1976. Coleco would release a number of consoles in their Telstar series, and they'd start with a dedicated home Pong console. Interestingly enough, they were able to undercut everyone's prices due to some assistance from none other than Ralph Baer. In his book, Video Games in the Beginning, Ralph Baer details a trip that he took to Long Island in March of 1975, where he visited a company called General Instrument. GI had taken note of the Pong craze and saw an opportunity. They shrunk all of the hardware required to play Pong-style games onto a singular silicon-based chip. So if you're General Instrument and want to get the word out about your revolutionary technology, who better to demonstrate it for than the father of video games himself? However, it wasn't Magnavox that Baer would race to tell about this new technology. According to Baer, his first call was to Arnold Greenberg, president of Coleco. Heeding Baer's advice, Coleco pre-ordered enough chips to effectively corner the market for a short time. Coleco became the first and most preferred customer of General Instrument. With these chips, manufacturing costs went way down, allowing for Coleco to price their first wave of consoles significantly below the price of their competition. Atari owned the trademark for Pong, but due to its popularity, GI's 6-game TV game chip effectively came to be known as Pong on a chip, neither of which roll off the tongue very well, but its effectiveness cannot be denied. This might sound like a nefarious move by Ralph Baer. In reality, it was perfectly aligned with everyone's interests, unless you were a company looking to make a Pong console. Ralph Baer was never actually an employee of Magnavox. He was the credited inventor of some of the tech used in the original Odyssey, but Sanders Associates was the official owner of those patents and Magnavox their sole licensee. As Magnavox began settling lawsuits and collecting licensing fees, it actually became beneficial for them to have as many clones on the market as possible. This created more opportunities for licensing fees or lawsuits. This was all orchestrated by Baer, who actually helped Coleco again when their initial Telstar inventory didn't pass the FCC's radio frequency interference testing. Baer agreed to help them fix the problem on the condition that they signed a licensing agreement with Magnavox. If chaos truly is a ladder, then Ralph Baer certainly knew how to climb it. In late 1976, after finally getting their hands on the Pong on a chip technology, Magnavox released the Odyssey 300. It was released amidst far greater competition than the original Magnavox Odyssey or even the 100 and 200 had to contend with. We know the Magnavox Odyssey 300 was released with the intention of competing with other devices that had undercut their prices. Without any advertisements from the time of release, the best I could do was secondary sources that list the initial launch price of the console at $69. This was a simplified version of the 200. Released in 1976, the black and white console featured tennis, hockey, and smash. Doubles mode was exclusive to hockey, with one paddle guarding the goal and the other playing offense on your opponent's side of the ice. This was a shift from having two paddles as close together as they were on the Odyssey 200. The controller was also simplified, abandoning the 3-knob design in favor of 1 knob. In doing so, the gameplay changed, removing the only elements that made Magnavox brand consoles unique. With the 3-knob design, you could put spin on the ball and move the paddle horizontally. The 1-knob design limited the paddle to vertical movement only and removed the ability to control the spin of the ball. Instead, the paddle was divided into segments. Which segment of the paddle the ball made contact with determined the angle of the hit. In some ways, this sounds like a step backwards from their previous offerings, but they did make some improvements. For the first time in the 100 series, the game kept score using a digital number display. The 300 also came with preset difficulty levels that affected the speed of the ball and the size of the paddles. Regardless, can you imagine getting a PS2 in the year 2000 and finding out that it was actually just a cheaper to manufacture version of the PS1? Of course, Magnavox couldn't help themselves and decided to release not one, but two more consoles alongside the 300, a strategy not shared by Philips overseas, who would skip the remainder of the 100 series. The Magnavox Odyssey 400 and 500 were also released in late 1976, but neither were made using Pong on a chip. The chip itself was a way to reduce manufacturing costs, but it also meant stripping away elements that gave Magnavox brand Pong consoles their own identity. The 400 brought some of those concepts back, and the 500 took them further. The 400 was a souped-up version of the 200. It sold for $100 at launch according to a Popular Mechanics article from October of 1976. This console was designed for players who enjoyed having more control, returning to the 3-knob controls that allowed for horizontal movement and spin control. The system played tennis, hockey, and smash, and featured doubles mode for both hockey and tennis. Doubles mode reverted back to having 2 paddles on each player's side instead of the goalie offense setup of the 300. The difficulty settings of the 300 were not included. Instead, a slider on the console offered an array of ball speeds. The Odyssey 500 was the first home console to produce color graphics. It initially retailed for $130, but like other models, saw its price drop almost immediately upon release. Not only was the 500 a color console, it also featured human player sprites as opposed to just paddles. It played tennis, hockey, smash, and soccer. The console had sliders on it that offered players the ability to mix and match playing fields and character sprites. The 500 also retained the 3-knob control scheme. Despite dropping doubles mode, this was by far the most innovation a dedicated home Pong console had seen up to this point. But it wouldn't hold that status for long. This whole tiered pricing strategy thing they were doing was rather ineffective and did nothing to change Magnavox's fate. They would continue to get dominated in terms of sales, primarily by Atari and Coleco in the United States. Globally speaking, brands like Binatone and Commodore released Pong consoles for the European market. Meanwhile, in Japan, a little company called Nintendo made waves with its first foray into the home console market. Nintendo released 2 home Pong consoles in Japan in June of 1977 that are rarely mentioned in the histories I've read. According to David Sheff's book, Game Over, the Color TV Game 6 and Color TV Game 15 consoles are said to have sold about 1 million units each. This puts each of them among the best-selling consoles of the era. Back in the US of A, Magnavox would make one final push in the home Pong space. Naturally, this meant releasing 3 more consoles. In what can only be described as a masterclass in not learning from your mistakes, Magnavox released the Odyssey 2000, Odyssey 3000, and Odyssey 4000 in 1977. All 3 consoles were announced at CES in January of 1977. Launch prices for all 3 models are difficult to pin down. Regardless, retailers would drop the prices of all 3 models so that they were more in line with offerings available from other companies. In many ways, the 2000 felt like a step back from the 500, specifically a step back to the 300. It was a black and white console that played tennis, hockey, and smash, with formal difficulty levels making their return. Like the 300, hockey was played with 1 goalie paddle and 1 offense paddle on the opponent's side of the screen. The 3000 was largely the same, but without formal difficulty levels. Instead, the difficulty became more customizable, with switches that controlled ball speed, paddle size, and the angle that the ball could take on contact. Each switch had a pro and amateur setting. The biggest change, however, was the addition of wired controllers. Gone were the days of huddling over the console. This would be a bigger milestone if it hadn't already been done by the original Magnavox Odyssey. The 2000 and 3000 both used Pong on a chip, but the Magnavox Odyssey 4000 used a more advanced version. The AY-3-8600 improved upon the game logic, and the addition of the AY-3-8615 brought back color. The 4000 featured classics like tennis, hockey, and smash while bringing back soccer, which played almost identically to hockey. They also added games like basketball, yes, this is meant to be basketball you're looking at, and gridball, which played like inverted foosball. The console had switches on the front to customize difficulty in similar fashion to the 3000, but this time, the ball speed switch offered a slow mode, where the ball speed remained constant, and a fast mode, where the speed of the ball gradually increased as the volley went on. This was a staple in arcade Pong that eventually made its way into home consoles, made possible by the updated chip. Up to this point, Magnavox controllers featured knobs. The 4000 was the first to feature a joystick. The joystick allowed for multi-directional movement. This was a first for Magnavox, but not a first for the industry. The Fairchild Channel F beat them to it by about a year. Back across the pond, Philips released a version of the 2000 also in 1977 that was largely the same as the version released by Magnavox. There were slight cosmetic differences, and the sound played through the TV rather than a speaker attached to the console, as had become customary in the North American versions. This time around, Philips would take a page from the Magnavox playbook, releasing a deluxe version of the 2000 that same year, calling it the Philips Odyssey 2001. Despite similar marketing strategies and naming conventions, the 2001 is where the Philips versions of the consoles began to separate themselves from the Magnavox versions. From a technical perspective, this console fell somewhere between the 3000 and 4000 that had been released in North America. It had color graphics, higher quality sound, better game logic, but was limited to the three classics: tennis, hockey, and Smash. Paddle length was customizable, ball speed increased as the game went on, and additional obstacles were added to the hockey game mode to increase difficulty and add variance to the gameplay. If you hadn't been bombarded by Pong consoles like consumers in the US, this probably felt like an actual upgrade. The culmination of Philips' innovation in the home Pong department was the Philips Odyssey 2100, released in 1978. The full-color console had 6 games: tennis, soccer, hockey, Smash, Elimination, which was kind of like Brick Breaker, and Flipper, which was like Pong presentation meets pinball gameplay. These 6 games each had several different variations, totaling 23 unique experiences. There were also true single-player games as opposed to just practice modes that had been featured in the consoles before it. Stateside, Magnavox had one more Pong console up their sleeve, and up their sleeve it would stay. The North American market was completely oversaturated with home Pong consoles by the end of 1977, which Magnavox contributed to greatly, though they weren't alone. All these consoles flying onto your screen right now were released sometime between 1974 and 1978, and this isn't even close to all of them. The Magnavox Odyssey 5000 would have been similar to the Philips Odyssey 2100. It had 4-player games, and just as many games to choose from as its European counterpart. It was cancelled in favor of the Magnavox Odyssey 2, Magnavox's first true programmable cartridge-based console. And thank God, because I have had just about enough of the naming conventions of Magnavox's Pong consoles. 1977 was a rough year for Magnavox. They debated canceling the Odyssey 2 as well, but ended up pushing forward. The console was released in late 1978. By this point, Magnavox was even further behind some of their competition, with many having programmable cartridge-based consoles on the market already. The Channel F by Fairchild was released in 1976. 1977 saw the release of the RCA Studio 2, the Coleco Telstar Arcade, and the now famous Atari 2600. Hell, even Bally beat the Odyssey 2 to market with the Astrocade and its gas pump controller in early 1978. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 was marketed as the ultimate computer video game system. And I mean, come on, just look at that keyboard. The console was pushed as an educational tool on top of being a home entertainment system. The keyboard itself wasn't a very good piece of hardware, and its designation as an educational tool was more of a marketing ploy than a legitimate function. The keyboard was mainly utilized for master strategy-style games that incorporated physical board game elements in their design. The Odyssey 2 also featured a voice synthesizer as a hardware add-on. The voice was actually one area where Magnavox was ahead of its competition. It was integrated into many of their titles and functioned without any major slowdowns to gameplay. The Odyssey 2 had a few popular games in its day, most notably UFO, Pickaxe Pete, Quest for the Rings, and Killer Bees. though the game that was arguably their most popular would bring about an ironic twist of fate. The game was called Casey Munchkin. It was a maze chase game akin to Pac-Man, but honestly a little bit more innovative for the time. The game had 4 standard mazes to choose from, and featured invisible versions of those mazes where the maze outline disappeared while the character was moving. The game also featured a maze editor that utilized the keyboard, and a random maze mode that used procedurally generated mazes. The total number of playable mazes was practically limitless. During a time when Magnavox was winning lawsuits left and right, the release of Casey Munchkin would put them on the wrong side of one. Casey Munchkin's main character, ghost-like baddies, and sound design would draw the ire of Atari. Atari had acquired the exclusive home console rights to Pac-Man from Namco. Their home console port wouldn't hit the market until 1982. They sued Magnavox, claiming that Casey Munchkin's look and sound infringed upon their exclusive rights to the Pac-Man brand on home consoles. It didn't help that Magnavox themselves was advertising it as a Pac-Man-like game. Magnavox would be forced to remove Casey Munchkin from store shelves. They would later release a revised version called Casey's Crazy Chase that avoided future legal scrutiny. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 was easily the most successful console they ever made. It had the longest production run, the most units sold, and generated the most revenue of any console released by Magnavox. This did very little to improve Magnavox's standing in the industry. Magnavox continued to lag behind Atari, Coleco, and Mattel, who had burst onto the scene with the Intellivision in 1979. We'll go into more detail regarding Mattel and Coleco in a future episode. For now, it's worth noting that Coleco ran into financial trouble in the late 70s. While the release of the ColecoVision in 1982 would give them a brief glimmer of hope, they would bow out of the video game market altogether in 1985. Mattel's fate was similar. After seeing early success with the Intellivision, Mattel's electronics division was losing hundreds of millions of dollars by 1983. They eventually sold off the Intellivision business to InTV Corporation the following year. Mattel had more success internationally than Coleco, though neither of them had a strong enough foothold overseas to combat the eventual video game market crash of 1983 in the United States. To put all this into perspective, let's take a look at some sales figures. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 and its European counterpart, the Philips VideoPac G7000, stayed in production for 5 to 6 years and combined to sell around 2 million units. The ColecoVision's production run lasted about 3 years. Coleco claims to have shipped 6 million units to retailers, though the actual unit sold estimate is closer to 2 million. Mattel's Intellivision would stay in production for about 10 years, though it would use different branding after its sale to InTV Corp in 1984. The original Intellivision is estimated to have sold somewhere between 3.5 to 3.75 million units. InTV never released sales figures for their versions. The Atari 2600 was in production for nearly 3 times as long as the Odyssey 2 and sold roughly 30 million units worldwide. Magnavox had plans for an Odyssey 3, but they would scrap the console in 1983. After years of oversaturation in the US, the market had officially collapsed. Globally, the video game market remained in fairly good standing, and Philips continued releasing consoles. The Philips VideoPac G7200 was released in 1983. It was a revised version of the G7000 that featured a 9-inch black and white display. The console produced full-color graphics when hooked up to a standard TV set. The Philips VideoPac Plus G7400 was also released in 1983 in limited quantities. It was comparable to the Magnavox Odyssey 3 prototype that was demonstrated in the States before its untimely cancellation. However, Magnavox had made some pretty lofty promises in the form of features that did not come to pass in the G7400 version. Magnavox had planned to include a built-in modem, an improved mechanical keyboard, a built-in voice synthesizer, and a Laserdisc interface. None of these features ended up in the G7400. Philips also released the VideoPac N60 in 1984. It was similar to the G7200, but without the ability to connect to a regular TV set and was exclusive to the Netherlands and France. None of these consoles would sell as well in Europe as the G7000 had. Philips had more success in Europe than Magnavox had in the United States. They would continue to make consoles into the late 90s. Phillips also played something of a significant role, albeit indirectly and unintentionally, in the eventual creation of the first PlayStation, a story for another time. After the cancellation of the Odyssey 3, Magnavox's run as a console developer was over. They would, however, continue to collect royalties from other console developers until the early 90s. These royalties were by far their most effective moneymaker during their 10-plus year run in the home console market. Magnavox marketed its consoles poorly, contributed greatly to the market's oversaturation, and while having more clones on the market helped them make more money in licensing fees, it also created more competition than they were prepared to deal with. Now, one might think that the shift to programmable cartridge-based consoles would have stopped Magnavox from collecting royalties and suing people. I did. But, as I should have known, it's never quite that simple. Make no mistake about it, Magnavox absolutely dominated the court of law. Though, according to Ralph Baer, it took nearly 3 years of convincing for Magnavox to make their move. While they had many at their disposal, 3 patents in particular proved key in Magnavox's court dealings. U.S. Patent number 3728480, U.S. Patent Reissue number 28507, and U.S. Patent Reissue 28598. All of them were issued in some combination to Ralph Baer, Bill Rush, and Bill Harrison. Though, per their employment agreements, Sanders Associates was the owner of the patents. To make this easier for me, we'll refer to them as the 598, the 507, and the 480. The 598 largely covered how to build and connect a gaming apparatus to make the gameplay function on a regular TV. The 507 focused on specific gameplay elements like user-controlled images that bounced, hit stuff, changed directions, and a variety of other video game functions. It specifically mentions a ping-pong game as an example. The 480 was the broadest patent among them, essentially encompassing everything required to run a home video game system. There is a lot of overlapping language in the patents. To the uneducated, me, it feels like, at times, they're all saying the same thing in a different way. Point being, they had all of their bases covered from a legal perspective. As the exclusive licensee of Sanders' patents, Magnavox was legally responsible to protect their intellectual property. To ignore this duty would have been a breach of contract. And so, patent infringement lawsuits popped up like rifts to the Chaos Realm in Warhammer 3. The initial wave of lawsuits came in the mid-1970s following the arcade Pong boom. Magnavox went after a bunch of companies concurrently. The collection of companies targeted by Magnavox included, but were not limited to, Bally, Midway, Chicago Coin, Allied Leisure, and APF Electronics. The most famous among the first group of lawsuits was undoubtedly Atari. It's through the Atari lawsuit we can best understand what allowed Magnavox to act as a toll collector for anyone participating in the burgeoning video game industry. It was through this lawsuit that the Magnavox-Atari rivalry was born. More specifically, this was the beginning of the Ralph Baer-Nolan Bushnell rivalry. Both men saw themselves as visionaries, viewing themselves as great inventors and innovators of their time, and they were. But for their few similarities, Nolan Bushnell and Ralph Baer were polar opposites in more than a few ways. Bushnell did not share Baer's affinity for note-taking and patent filings. Atari was the first player in the arcade Pong market, but Bushnell hadn't taken the same care as Baer in protecting his creations. Whether those creations were his to begin with is a different story entirely. Nonetheless, Atari's arcade Pong cabinets were an immediate hit, and with its success, a seemingly endless wave of clones followed. Bushnell did apply for a patent, U.S. Patent number 3793483, but he applied too late, and by the time he finally got it, the clones were consuming the market. Stephen L. Kent has the most generous figure, stating Atari's Pong cabinets accounted for less than 1/3 of the cabinets out in the wild, though other historians place the number closer to 10%. Bushnell would refer to these cloners as the Jackals. Atari's status as a true garage-style startup company meant bigger companies were producing cabinets much faster. It also made fighting and losing a lawsuit a potentially terminal situation for the company. Despite the arcade Pong concept becoming a global phenomenon, Atari wasn't reaping a majority of the benefits. They were struggling financially when they were hit with a patent infringement lawsuit from Magnavox in April of 1974. With its life on the line, Nolan Bushnell and Atari channeled their inner Matt Damon, refusing to go gently into that good night. And so Atari decided to go on the counteroffensive, filing for a declaratory judgment action in the Northern District of California. What that meant is that Atari was challenging the validity of the 507 and the 598 patents. Atari argued that Sanders should never have been granted the patents in the first place. They contended that manipulating symbols on a television screen was simply not a novel idea. These patents, they argued, were nothing more than a clever repackaging of concepts people had been using for years. Atari's lawyers cited Tennis for Two along with a litany of patents that included image generation, moving images, hit detection, and more. This strategy did not work. Tennis for Two was disqualified for a few reasons. It was played on an oscilloscope that featured a vector display as opposed to a raster TV display. It was also not considered to be public knowledge as it was a one-off experiment that was eventually shelved and put away. To be clear, this didn't necessarily stop Magnavox from collecting royalties on games using vector displays, as many of them still infringed on the 507 patent that centered around user-controlled images, collision detection, and the objects that were influenced by said collision. All of the other patents cited were disqualified largely on the basis that they lacked player interaction, which was a key distinction made in the patents owned by Sanders and licensed to Magnavox. The discovery phase for Magnavox v. Atari began in 1974 and continued throughout 1975. During this time, Atari moved forward with its plans to partner with Sears. They released a home version of Atari's Pong under the name Sears Telegames Pong. But, in doing so, Sears...
You just made the list! Oh my gosh.
Perhaps the most damning thing to happen to Atari throughout the pre-trial process was Nolan Bushnell's deposition in January of 1976. Someone in the comments of the last episode said that Nolan Bushnell was a pathological liar. It's time to take a closer look at that claim. But first, a little background on patent law. Patent law has changed in a number of ways over the last 5 decades. For the purposes of Magnavox v. Atari, there is one important distinction to make. In patent law, who came first has always been a significant factor in litigation. In 2013, what it meant to be first was redefined. The Leahy-Smith America Invents Act established that the first inventor to file the paperwork for a particular invention is the true and legal patent holder. To be clear, people can't go crazy filing patents for anything that comes to mind. The person filing the patent has to be able to describe the invention in a way where someone from the same field can follow their instructions and build it. This is an oversimplification of patent law in America post-2013, but it serves us well enough. Back in 1976, things worked a little differently. The time of your filing wasn't the end-all be-all if a rival could produce evidence that they conceived the invention or a version of the invention first. You might already see why the laws favored Ralph Baer and Magnavox at the time due to Baer's propensity for note-taking and patent filing. That wouldn't stop Nolan Bushnell from trying. Now, let's take a look at that deposition. The most thorough and detailed recounting of the deposition that I could find was done by Alexander Smith, annotating his own book, They Create Worlds, Volume 1. A partial transcript of the deposition is also available on Keith Smith's blog, All in Color for a Quarter. Bushnell is asked if he had any personal involvement in the playing of games utilizing cathode ray tube displays prior to December 31st, 1969. Bushnell says yes, claiming he recalled playing a game on a computer at the University of Utah. That game was Space War. But upon being asked when this occurred, I have been trying to pinpoint that. I think it was in the neighborhood of 1965. It was shortly after I came to the University of Utah. 1965 is the same year that Utah established its computer science department. He claimed he had a friend who told him the computer center had some great games, and so one night they went over there and played them. When asked what this friend's name is, the best Bushnell could do was Jim. He knew his last name started with the letter D, but couldn't quite remember. When asked which device Space War was running on, Bushnell initially couldn't recall that either, but said that he tends to think that it was the UNIVAC 1108, a computer that didn't arrive on Utah's campus until 1966. Bushnell goes on to explain that he wouldn't interact with any computer games until about a year later. He explained that a fraternity brother named Randall Willey helped him get a copy of Space War. He admitted that he wasn't skilled enough to make something on his own at the time, but did make alterations to Space War. But what about Fox and Geese? He made that game, right? Well, at first, I thought he might have, but it seems I may have fallen into the Nolan Bushnell smoke and mirror funhouse as well. In 2010, in a post made on the Atari Age forums, he claims to have made the game. The Deposition paints a different picture. In the Deposition, he claims to have seen Fox and Geese in 1970 at the Stanford AI laboratory, but makes no claim of invention. The real point of contention is that many believe Nolan Bushnell couldn't have played Space War at Utah in 1965, and given how often he hedges his answers with "I don't remember" or "I'm not sure," it's hard to rely on him as someone who can establish an accurate timeline. But they were able to put on the record that games like Space War and Fox and Geese were played on an extremely expensive computer rather than a consumer TV set. Computers were so expensive at the time that it was hard to reconcile games being played on a computer as the same thing as games being played on a TV. As to whether or not Bushnell was actually working on video games in 1965 or 1966, Alexander Smith, author of We Create Worlds, helps us out. In 2018, he tracked down Randall Willey and, in a phone interview, asked if there were any games at the Utah Computer Center at the time. Willey had this to say: "There might have been. I don't recall a lot of that. I don't recall any games going on." Now, there is a chance that Willey did help Bushnell acquire a copy of Space War and simply doesn't remember doing so. It was 60 years ago. And maybe Bushnell really didn't remember what had happened 10 years prior to the Deposition. But what about 3 years prior to the Deposition? The Space War at Utah story conflicts with a documentary that was made in 1973 by UC Berkeley journalism students.
The AI project, where Bushnell first played Space War, is the Artificial Intelligence Project, nestled in the hills behind Stanford University in Palo Alto, California.
Historians place Bushnell's move to California sometime around late 1968 or early 1969, as that's around the time that he began working at Ampex in Sunnyvale. But maybe the narrator misspoke. Let's see what Bushnell had to say during his interview featured in the piece.
We used to play Space War a lot at the AI project at Stanford, which is a big computer complex. And one day it just hit, this is a lot of fun. I'd be able to package it and sell it for a price. And, one thing leads to another, and pretty soon, from doodling on a scratch pad, you're actually working out some basic block diagrams, and from there you think, boy, it's going to work.
He doesn't explicitly say that it's the first time that he played Space War, but, as Alexander Smith points out, there's no mention of the University of Utah or long-standing dreams of an arcade empire in the piece either. In another interview, also from 1973, this one with Business Week magazine, he claimed that the idea for Pong stems from his earlier days playing games at the Utah Computer Lab. At best, his memory is inconsistent. At worst, he has intentionally given a vague testimony, neither of which are particularly helpful to Atari in a court of law. The true smoking gun presented in the Deposition was a guestbook from a promotional tour put on by Magnavox in mid-1972. They made a stop in Burlingame, California, where Bushnell not only saw the Magnavox Odyssey, but actually played the table tennis game mode. Bushnell had signed this guestbook and admitted to both seeing the system and playing the game. Only a few months after that show, Al Alcorn was assigned Pong as his first project at Atari, and the rest, as they say, is history. Even after this admission under oath, Bushnell has told his version of the story for decades.
And when did you first encounter Space War?
No, the first one was called Computer Space, which was an adaptation of the Space Wars that we played in the computer labs all during college.
My very first experience with electronic games, if you were to consider them to be video, would be at the University of Utah. The fraternity brother said, "Meet me at the engineering lab at 1 o'clock tomorrow night." And we played Space War.
I was pursuing an engineering degree at the University of Utah. There was a professor whose main focus was hooking up video displays to big computers. And I got to play the game called Space War.
And I played it at the university and fell in love with it. It was at the University of Utah.
In Stephen L. Kent's book, there is a quote from Bushnell regarding the Magnavox promotional tour. What they've always alleged was that there was a meeting or a distributor show somewhere in the valley, and I should have, would have, could have been there. So it's one of those pissing matches. In an interview with Vintage Computing and Gaming from 2007, he goes as far as to say that he has a signed and witnessed lab book to prove that he had been working on these things in college, but admits that the Magnavox Odyssey reminded him of some of his earlier designs. He takes this even further, claiming he presented this lab book during the deposition. I have scoured through 80 pages worth of deposition notes and found no mention of this lab book he speaks of. The only mention of anything like this are 2 pieces of paper he found at the bottom of a box of junk and a college paper that he couldn't even find a copy of. So was Nolan Bushnell a pathological liar? I guess it's possible. I don't think it's fair to say without examining the entirety of his life. At the very least, he was a guy who didn't think there would be copies of the deposition floating around the internet all these years later. But you know, if you really listen to people, sometimes they'll tell you the truth.
I was probably the only guy that was a carny and an engineer.
Bushnell seems to subscribe to the ideology that perception is reality, and when it comes to product promotion, that can sometimes be the case. It's also likely that he told the incorrect story so many times that he has begun to believe it himself. The one thing Atari did have going for it was Bushnell's patent, US patent number 3793483, for a video image positioning control system. They used it to outline the ways in which the devices were different. The argument was that Magnavox was making analog devices and Atari digital ones. According to Julian Mylan's book, The Game That Never Ends, How Lawyers Shape the Video Game Industry, Atari's lawyers thought that they had enough to win the case. Atari's lawyers said as much in a letter to Warner Communications assessing the state of Atari. Warner had been in talks about acquiring the startup. They would eventually buy Atari for $28 million. To go to trial and lose would all but guarantee that deal going to the wayside, or at the very least, make Atari a much cheaper company to acquire. Instead, Magnavox and Atari settled, and Atari was given an extraordinarily favorable deal. Atari agreed to a $1.5 million licensing fee. They paid Magnavox in 8 installments and were exempt from future royalty payments in perpetuity. Bushnell also claims to have negotiated terms that Magnavox would continue to go after Atari's competition, legally speaking, like Mr. Burns releasing the Hounds. Though I've gotta say, it feels like a ridiculous thing to take credit for, given that Magnavox had already issued plenty of lawsuits. Not to mention it was in their own financial interest to continue doing so. Bushnell's negotiating prowess aside, you might be wondering how Atari was able to pull this off. By mid-1976, Atari had turned their financial situation around with both the home Pong console and the commercial success of Breakout. There were other players in the industry on the come-up, but Atari was the most noteworthy gaming brand of the time. Giving Atari favorable financial terms encouraged them to settle. Part of the settlement included Atari's admission of infringement, which officially set a legal precedent on the matter. In settling, Atari was able to put the matter behind them, and it gave Magnavox an even stronger argument in its other suits. And just like that, the first domino had fallen. Chicago Coin was a bit more bold than Atari. They took Magnavox to trial and lost. In the process, an important ruling was made on one of Ralph Baer's patents. During the trial, Ralph Baer's 480 patent was granted pioneer status. Pioneer status is a special classification given to patents that cover groundbreaking, foundational inventions. Essentially, the judge in the case was declaring the 480 patent as ground zero for TV-based video game development. Pioneer status gives a patent much broader protection than your average patent, making it even more difficult for companies to fight against Magnavox. With the Atari settlement and a Pioneer patent under its belt, Magnavox had everything it needed to handle the remaining players, of which there are a few noteworthy ones. In 1982, Activision, the video game industry's first third-party developer, found itself caught in Magnavox's crosshair. Third-party developers are independent companies that make and sell their own games for someone else's console. They pay the console maker a royalty fee for each cartridge sold. Magnavox filed an infringement suit on the basis that Activision was infringing on the 507 patent. Activision wasn't necessarily infringing just because they were making game cartridges, but the minute those cartridges were inserted into a console and player-controlled images were generated, it became infringement, sort of like a patent infringement jigsaw puzzle. In the legal world, this is known as contributory infringement. Activision lost, appealed, and lost again. Magnavox had one other major player to deal with, one they thought they had handled already, that being Nintendo. Nintendo had an interesting strategy in its attempt to shed their royalty payments. In 1977, Nintendo entered a sub-license agreement with Magnavox. In 1982, they just stopped paying. Nintendo figured their newer technology fell outside the scope of the original agreement. They put the ball in Magnavox's court to see how they'd respond. Magnavox responded by suing them. Of course they did. This is what they do. What started as a bold, rebellious plan morphed into a play similar to ones we've seen before. In 1986, Nintendo filed for a declaratory judgment action against Magnavox's patents, claiming they were invalid, arguing that Magnavox deliberately failed to disclose the existence of prior art, including Tennis for Two and Space War, both of which had already been argued several times unsuccessfully throughout the 70s. They also accused Magnavox of acting inequitably in the process of filing their patents. This included having an improper, off-the-record meeting with the patent examiner prior to the filing of the 507 application. There were several other arguments that didn't stick, and the case never went to full trial. Like they had in every other case, Magnavox walked away a winner once again. In the process, all Nintendo really accomplished was trading their royalty fees for legal bills before ultimately going back to paying royalty fees.
Fucking lawyers, man, right?
When all was said and done, Magnavox proved more competent in court than they ever had as a console developer. And it really wasn't even close. 20 years and $100 million later, Magnavox's reign of patent lawsuit terror would come to an end in the early 90s as the patents eventually expired. Magnavox may not have been the dominant console developer Ralph Baer had hoped they would be, but on an individual basis, Ralph Baer would go on to be known as the father of video games, or the forgotten father, depending on who you ask. According to Baer, even Nolan Bushnell would eventually concede the title to him. Baer jokingly told him he wished he had told that to the press. He also wrote a book detailing his life and career, and was awarded the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President George W. Bush in 2006. Ralph Baer had a process. He took notes meticulously, protected his inventions diligently, and surrounded himself with talented people to assist him. Our friends at Atari also had a process, one that involved working hard and partying harder. They were a true garage startup, fighting against all of the big guys to secure a piece of the market that they popularized. Not only would Atari secure a spot within the industry, they would dominate it. To this day, Atari remains one of the most iconic and instantly recognizable brands within the video game industry. As a business, they had their moment in the sun, but as we'll soon learn, it wasn't built to last.